Yeah, I've been in the identity and access management space for this past decade. And so I'm really happy to have Anupa with me as well. And with that, Anup, could you move on to the next slide? So before Anup goes into the how-to of adaptive access security, I really would like to discuss the business imperative of that. Here you can see what happens when a breach happens in your organization. Hopefully, you can all map yourself to one of those categories. This is worldwide, and so if you're in the U.S., you could probably add another 30 to 40% of costs. So when an organization is breached, this is the cost incurred on them, and that includes things like finding, remediating the breach, lost revenue that you may have incurred during that time frame, lost customers or lost consumer trust, and even potential fines is all built into that number. So this is really the why authentication really matters. And if you go to the next slide, Anup, we can see that in the top right percentage, which by the way has been the same percentage for the last 20 years, it's been somewhere between 70 some odd into the 80s. The foundation of a breach is really leveraging credentials, either by phishing or hacking them. And we can see from the bottom two stats that users really don't care. That they really don't think it's their problem. We probably all have friends or family that don't care, or maybe you're one of them, where I know I have, with my associations, I've talked about the importance of setting up a strong authentication, and so often it's just a topic that no one's interested in. So the consumer doesn't really care about your organizational risk. It's your problem, not theirs. They're really all about the path of least resistance, for sure. Next slide. So the past dozen years or so, it's really been interesting watching how mandates have evolved. They really did start initially as recommendations and policies, best practices, and then they evolved into from generalized policies to more concrete mandates, and then mandates with fines. And I see this, and then more strict mandates with bigger fines. And I see this trend just continuing as protected data continues to get hacked, whether it be patient information, whether it be HR information, financial information, all of the kinds of data that the government tries to protect. As their policies fall short, as their mandates fall short, I see this getting more strict. Next slide, Anup. And while the government mandates were really selective, right? It's either certain companies that work in regulated industries, or it could be narrowed down to certain departments, right? Whether it be HR, perhaps financial services, and not the rest of the company. This new market market dynamic of cyber insurance is really horizontal across everyone, right? So cyber insurance has become really popular the last several years. And as the policy issuers pay out big claims, their response is, first of all, they tend to reduce what they'll cover in the claims, but they also are putting or imposing security practices onto the policyholders themselves. And authentication and multi-factor authentication are specific items covered in these policies. So while organizations have been able to get away with kind of a narrow application of it, it's becoming more pervasive across the market. Next slide. So here's a quick review of authentication. We have the traditional username password that's been around for forever. And we have, typically in a two-factor setup that some type of passwordless technology is placed on top of that, whether you have a username and password, and then there's a PIN or SMS or an out-of-band push or whatever it may be. That's the most common scenario. There's also increasingly multi-factors that go beyond just two-factor. For example, I use Microsoft Authenticator, so it requires that I have something, that I have my smartphone. That's one factor. And then to get into the app, I got to touch my my fingerprint reader, and that's another factor. And then to protect against approval fatigue that attackers use, I noticed the beginning of a session, Authenticator also requires they'll give me a number that I got to type in as well. That's something I know. So multi-factor is becoming a increasing tool over just two-factor. I call out strong or passwordless authentication for a very specific reason, not only to enable the two-factor scenarios, but on its own, it has inherent security advantages over traditional username and password. You really can't phish passwordless authentication, and the workarounds to try to penetrate that are far more the barrier far higher than just a traditional password. And we're seeing more frequently passwordless being more than just a way to do two-factor, but on its own being a way to verify someone before letting them go on to the task they want to do. Next slide. If we look at these two metrics here on the right side, the consumer-based ones, you'll notice that authentication is a big deal as far as lost business. If there's some people that they can't remember their credential, others where they're not working, or there's some kind of barrier to it. I've had situations where I have the business has done a MFA and I don't have my phone next to me, or the app, or I'm not getting the message, or the app isn't working right, and those all cause abandonments. And there are those that if they're not guests, they're just not going to participate. It's interesting, though, that same difficulty translates there on the left in the business world. Almost half of organizations view MFA as an obstacle to get their users to really adopt it and to get approval to adopt it from sponsors, business owners. I think the stat there, the 3 out of 4 stat's really interesting, that beyond just security, a lot of organizations, majority of organizations, look at passwordless as a way to reduce the friction and increase productivity. Next slide. So here we have authentication where both convenience and simplicity and fast user action is really a strong dynamic in the whole authentication discussion. So that's just not security. And it can be a business enabler. It should be a business enabler. And one of the ways to make it a business enabler is to be able to calculate the risk and dynamically adjust to that. So on my phone, I have my credit union app. And in that, to get into the app, I use my fingerprint to get into the app. And I can go in and do most things. To do a higher risk operation, most commonly a dollar amount that exceeds a threshold, then to do that act within my mobile app, it requires me to read for me to do it to iris scan. So I got to put the camera up close to my face. I enrolled my iris years ago, and when the risk is high, that added verification is used. So to be clear, it's the same factor, right? My finger was a biometric, my eyes a biometric, but even though it's the same factor, it's just another level of verifying the identity. And I actually had the privilege of talking to the chief marketing officer of that credit union, and she talks about how every feature that they have and want to add into the mobile app is negotiated with the security teams to verify that the level of risk of that feature is in the threshold that that credit union finds acceptable. Let's go to the next slide, Anoop. This is really the why dynamic access security is really important, because you can do more, if you can do more powerful interactions, whether internally with remote users or externally with your B2C relationships, if you can lower the risk or manage the risk with a higher level of verification, while at the same time not impeding the user, not frustrating the user or slowing them down. And so here, next slide, please. So before I transition over to Anoop, I did want Jenny to put up a polling question, and maybe she'll go ahead and ask it. We're going to get a polling question. There we go. And with that, Anoop, the results will be coming in shortly, but I'm going to go ahead and hand the ball off to Anoop.
Sure. Thanks, Kent. Probably I'll start with my introduction. So my name is Anoop Kumar Rajan, and I have close to 15 years of experience in the access management domain. So that's that way I have been working as an engineer, moved into product customer success, and right now I'm doing the product management for the access products in the identity and access management portfolio. So in the next 30 minutes or so, what we will do is we'll cover some of the best practices for the balancing act between security and the user experience in the authentication domain, right? So we'll explore how NetIQ products can help you to achieve that balance. And so let's start with the primary pain point in the authentication, which is handling and maintenance of passwords. I think Kent already mentioned about that. The research says that the reason behind 80% of the data breaches was password leaks. So how do you really solve that, right? So it's quite simple, in fact. So if you stop using passwords and if you stop storing passwords, your problem is solved, right? So one of the ways is go for passwordless authentication. So from a user perspective, there is no more password to remember. And from an organizational perspective, the data breaches, 90% or 80% of the data breaches can be avoided just because they are not using the passwords. So going to a little more detail. So what is passwordless authentication? It's basically verifying user identity without the use of a password. So it could be using what you have, which could be like an OTP or smartphone-based authentication, or even FIDO device-based authentication, or what you are, right? Like something like a biometric methods, the fingerprints, or the voice analysis itself. So let's look at what are the top benefits of passwordless authentications. I think Kent mentioned a few of them, so I'll just try to reiterate. One of the key things is that, so the common attacks like phishing, credential stuffing, brute force attacks, or even key logging, all of these work only when the attacker get hold of the user password or some login credentials. So in passwordless authentication, we are not storing any password or we are not using password. So that definitely is going to increase the cybersecurity posture or strengthen the cybersecurity posture. So that's one of the key benefit. And the second benefit is the user experience itself. So one of the challenge for any user is to remember passwords. So you are supposed to create and use different passwords for different application, and the challenge is to remember all those passwords. So since when you go for passwordless, definitely the user experience is gonna increase because you don't have to remember any password. But so you have seen that in some cases, the passwordless authentication also prompt for a PIN. So you don't have to get confused with that. It's more about authenticating to a device and not authenticating to the application. Right. So let's look at, so we discussed about the benefits of passwordless authentication. Let's look at some of the challenges which we have with the passwordless authentication. Right. One of the clear organizational challenge is the cost. So organization has to buy devices for the end users and distribute them across it. So that incurs a lot of cost. But what about the end user experience itself, right? So have you faced such a situation? So here the organization has implemented a passwordless authentication using U2F device. However, when the U2F device was required to perform the authentication, the user doesn't have it, right? So have you faced such situation? So definitely there are methods we can work around this. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. And this is where the NetIQ advanced authentications method chaining as a feature comes into picture, right? So I'm going to have a demo here. So let's talk about the demo use case. So what happens here is the user first access a public Medilab portal, suppose. And so when the user accesses the confidential, say the reports, the medical reports, what happens is since it is a confidential report, you'll be prompted with a passwordless authentication. So in this case, in my demo, it would be a U2F FIDO U2F device. And once the authentication is done, you get access to the report. But what if the user forgets? That's the case which we are talking about. So here, in the case of no U2F device, the administrator, in fact, can configure a chain of methods to be included in the authentication process itself, which means that the user gets options to select in case one of his devices is not available. So in this case, I'm going to show that instead of U2F device, user select the smartphone and gets authenticated and then get access to the report. So let's see a demo. So this is a demo video where I have shown you on the right side of your screen, you can see the mobile video camera, in fact, to really show how the U2F authentication happens. So to demonstrate, I'm inserting my U2F device into my laptop, right? And then going ahead and clicking on the patient records. Since it's a confidential report, it asks for identifying myself. So I enter my username, and then I get the passwordless authentication prompt. So since I have the U2F device at this point, I'll go ahead and then select the authentication, and it starts blinking. And when I tap on it, I get access to the report. Next, let's see what happens or how the user experience would be if I don't have the U2F device with me. To simulate that, let's remove the U2F device. So after removing the U2F device, I will go ahead and go with the same flow of accessing the patient records. I get prompted for the login. So I enter my username and the prompt for U2F. Now, the situation is that I don't have a U2F device. So I look for the methods which are there in the list. So here the administrator has configured smartphone authentication. I select that. And at the same time, I need the NetIQ advanced authentication app. Once I bring that, I'll press next and go for the smartphone authentication. Then I'll get an authentication request prompt and I get access to the report. Right. So that's a quick demo of the passwordless authentication and how you can really improve the user experience even with passwordless authentication when you by giving more options for the end user to select or to have a choice to select the different authentication methods. So before going to the more advanced level of authentication mechanisms, I just wanted to touch upon the multi-factor authentication. I'm not going to talk about more about it, but like Ken said, multi-factor authentication does have its challenges in terms of authentication friction itself. So multi-factor authentication is nothing but adding more and more factors to your authentication procedure, right? And more factors add more and more friction to the authentication process itself. So adaptive authentication really came primarily to solve this authentication friction or reduce the friction in the authentication. In the adaptive authentication, what you see is it can use the contextual and behavioral parameters to evaluate the risk. And based on the risk, the user will be prompted for authentication and given access to the resources. Right? So this is where the NetIQ risk service comes into play. So NetIQ risk service has all the capabilities to complete the adaptive authentication. Like it can consume the parameters, static risk parameters like user credentials, roles, profiles, which is the very basic part of it. And it can consume the contextual risk, like risk parameters like location of the access, location from the user is accessing, the device from which the user is accessing, and the resource which the user is accessing, right? At the same time, it can even consume information from the behavioral patterns or behavioral risk parameters, right? It uses another product from our portfolio. So I'll talk about that in a little while. So in addition to that, the risk service can even consume data from external applications. It could be an external REST interface or any external application. And based on all the information or the parameter values coming in from each of these parameters, the risk score would be calculated, right? And based on the risk score, there are multiple automated actions possible. The very basic is when the risk is very low, you could allow the access. And if the risk is more, you could, or the medium level, you could ask for reduced authorization or four-step-up authentication, or even trigger a micro-certification, which means you share the risk score to the identity governance, and then you can even trigger a micro-certification. Or else, when the risk is very high, you can directly deny access. So these are some of the sample automated actions which we can do. Let's look at so what happens when how the adaptive authentication can really help improve the user experience, right? So we can see that really from this example here. So here what happens is the location parameter is used to evaluate the risk, and based on that, the access would be given, right? So you can really see that the usability is hit here, right? The user knows that I'm accessing from a secure location, I'm accessing from a secure device, but every day when I access from home, I have to go through this authentication procedure of providing an OTP. I'm sure all of you would have faced this as a challenge at some point of your access to your office applications or enterprise applications. So let's see how we can actually handle this situation. So that's when the device fingerprinting comes into picture. So here what you see is the risk evaluation of the access would be based on the stored device parameters. So when the user accesses the resource from a device which is not known to the system, it would probably ask for a second factor authentication, and in the process, it will also store the device fingerprint. And from the next session onwards, the user will not be required to enter the second factor authentication. So that's what we are going to see here. So again, I have a demo use case to talk about. So in this case, suppose, say, a lab official accesses the Medilab portal and then accesses the patient reports. Of course, it's a confidential file, So definitely the user has to go through the first level of authentication, which could be anything. But in this demo, I'm using the name password authentication. But since the user is accessing from a new device, which is not known to the system, it will ask for a second factor authentication, right? So in this case, I think it's a U2F authentication. And once the second factor authentication is done, the user gets access to the report. Now let's see what happens in the background and during the process of the device fingerprinting, right? So you can see in the demo that once you provide the second factor authentication, user gets a device fingerprinting registration process where the user is asked for the consent and the user would be given an optional step to store the device fingerprint. So once the device fingerprint gets stored, the next access would be considered as a request from a non-device. And of course, going through the first factor authentication, after that, the user gets direct access to the report. Now, let's see that in a demo video. So to start with, the user is accessing the patient records from an unknown device and going through the name password authentication. As I said, since this is from an unknown device, it's asking for the second factor authentication. And this is the step where this is an option step where the user is prompted for a device registration. So you could allow that. And once the registration is done, your device is registered with the system. And the next time onwards, you can see that the authentication process itself becomes seamless and you don't have to go through the second factor authentication. So this is the second time access where I have to definitely enter the first factor authentication. And you can see that there is no prompt for any second factor, and you get access to the reports. So now let's walk through the configuration of device fingerprinting which made this happen, right? So in this, you will have to configure a risk-based policy. And in the device risk-based policy, you'll have to have a device fingerprinting rule in it. So let's see what is there in the device fingerprinting rule. So in the device fingerprinting rule, the configuration is in such a way that if the risk score comes above 50, you should be prompted for a second factor authentication. Otherwise, you just get access to the device. And this is the device fingerprinting rule, where it has multiple options like where to store the fingerprint, how much is its validity, whether to prompt for user consent, etc. Let's see the parameter settings here. So there are close to 11 parameter sets for the device fingerprinting. And you could configure these device fingerprinting parameters in two ways. You could configure those parameters in a group, which means that you have an option to select how much is the match percentage, right? You can see there is a drop down on top where it ranges from 0% to 100%, right? And say if you are selecting this percentage to 50% and with 55 parameters, so 50% of this match should be required to have a device fingerprinting match. Or else you can have another way to configure it to evaluate these parameters individually, which means that all the parameters in this list has to match during the fingerprinting evaluation. So it would be evaluated individually in this case. And you can have a mix of this parameter as well. Right? So, so that's from the device fingerprinting, the configuration. So just I have put this slide to show you that how much the extensive set of parameters which we have for the device fingerprinting. So you can see that it starts from the user profiling, goes to hardware parameters like type, touch support, etc., and to the operating system parameters, and to the browser parameters as well. So there are certain advanced parameters if you want more granular level of control, like HTML5 capabilities and WebGL. So this helps you to have granular control over the device fingerprinting itself. So any smaller change, if you want to detect, if your security controls are so stringent, then you could probably use any of these last two parameter set. So just a caution there. So since these are looking at granular things, it does take more CPU cycles. So it can be used. I would recommend these to be used only when you have a very stringent security requirements. So what we just saw was the risk evaluation using the contextual parameters. So next, what we will talk about is the evaluation using the behavioral analytics. So these are the two major capabilities of risk service. So let's look into what is there in the behavior analytics capabilities, right? So as you would have seen, risk can consume different parameters, contextual parameters, like locations, geofencing, the IP address, device fingerprinting, and the user profiles, etc. At the same time, it can also consume external application. And this is what we have used to integrate with another in-house application, which is the Intercept from ArcSight, right? So this application is using the unsupervised machine learning algorithms to analyze the user's behavior and before computing the risk. So it basically augments the human intelligence with the machine intelligence and definitely helps you to strengthen the cyber resilience. Right? So let's see how this behavior analytics work along with the risk surveys, right? So risk surveys, as we saw, it can identify the contextual data and it can also send events to the Intercept. At the same time, Intercept can acquire multiple events from various other sources like NetFlow, web proxy, the RDBMS, or other LDAP sources, and many others, right? And it can correlate this data with the machine learning constructed baselines. And finally, it can detect any anomalies in the behavioral patterns. So based on the anomaly detection, the aggregated risk scores are calculated, and the risk score is passed on to the risk service back. And risk service, based on the evaluated behavioral risk, can take action and control the access. It could even pass that information to any of the other applications or other controls like advanced authentication of access management or the identity governance and privileged access manager. So that's the level of control you can make by using or integrating between risk service and the behavior analytics. So let's see what are the benefits of tracking the user behavior, right? So like Kent earlier mentioned, around 60% of data breaches are caused by insiders. It could be intentionally or unintentionally, right? So the UEBA has the capability to detect both the malicious insider or an accidental insider. So that definitely reduces the risk for the organization, right? And so let's look at what is the fourth benefit here. So it's the ease of use. So I think I'll have to take an example here to explain about how UEBA can help to improve the user experience, right? So suppose an employee in a US organization regularly works from the user office, and as part of a travel, the employee has to travel to another country, say UK. And so if you have a contextual parameter-based risk configuration, what happens is when the user comes to UK and tries to access the resources from UK, there's a contextual change, and the user will have to go through multiple authentication, probably a multi-factor authentication, or else the user can be denied access as well, right? But in the case of UEBA has information from multiple sources. And so when the user is traveling from, say, US to UK, so UEBA can get information from sources to understand that the user is already moving the context or changing the context. And in the newer context, what are the secure locations from where the user can take access. So if the user is going to a UK office of the same organization and they are accessing from within the premise, probably UEBA will detect that there is no risk associated with it, and the user gets a seamless access to the resource. So that's how the user experience can be improved with the help of UEBA. Right. So
but I think also, just to jump in there really quick, Anoop, even though your use case here was an internal user behavior is an excellent excellent metric for outsiders as well, right? So it's all types of users for sure.
Sure. Yeah. So just one caution here. So we the capability added to the product, but due to some operational issues, we have not been able to deliver this for our customers' usage. So that's going to happen in the early part of 2024. So that's what we are targeting towards, right? So now we talked a lot about the benefits of adaptive authentication. So definitely there's a question coming up. Is adaptive authentication itself is sufficient or not, right? So as you would have seen, in adaptive authentication, risk is calculated before the authentication happens and before the session is created. So what if the user, after the session is created, what if the user moves out of the premise and moves to an insecure environment? Or say, what if the session itself is hijacked, right? So that's when the importance of continuous authentication and authorization comes into picture. So what happens here is the user session, even after the creation of the session, is monitored continuously throughout the session duration. And it looks for any foul play, and it triggers an action based on the foul play or any change in the context, right? So that's what is continuous authentication and authorization in a very nutshell. So let's try to see how the user behavior or how the user experience is going to be with respect to the continuous authentication and authorization. So here, what I'm going to demo is, so user is going to access a portal again from a trusted network. And since the user accesses the patient reports from a trusted network, you go through, you get access to the report after the first log. The next part is when, with the access to the reports, user moves out of the office premise. So maybe the user is going to change the network to an untrusted Wi-Fi. But as the session is already created in the browser, the session continues. So what we are going to see is that how the change in context is detected even after the session is created, right? So you can see that in the demo, the user accesses the reports again, but in this case, the network is untrusted and it asks for a second factor authentication. Once the second factor authentication is provided, user gets access to the report. So let's see that in a small demo here, right? So what you can see here is the user is accessing the patient records from a trusted network, right? And user gets access to the reports after the login. Now, to simulate that there is a contextual change, what I'm going to do is I will switch the network from a trusted Wi-Fi to my mobile hotspot, right? So let's give in a couple of seconds for the switch to happen. I'm trying to connect to the mobile hotspot. So after the network switch has happened, I will go ahead and then access the patient records again, which is the same session, right? I didn't have to go through the first factor authentication, but since the context is changed, the user is prompted for a second factor authentication. And once the second factor authentication is done, definitely user gets access to the report. Right? So now let's see how this is completely happening, right? So it's basically using the advanced session assurance feature in the Access Manager. And what are the benefits out of this? So the important benefit is that it prevents the session replay attacks or session hijacking itself. And how is it detected, basically, right? So in the background, the access management or access manager creates a unique fingerprint of the device. The fingerprint, when you talk about it, it is basically involving all the 11 parameter set, which I talked about. In addition to that, even it will consider the IP address as well. So based on all these parameter sets configured, the access manager will create a unique fingerprint of the device. And once the session is established, the fingerprint of the device is validated throughout the session, right? And if there is any difference in the fingerprint, so it can prompt for a second factor authentication. So currently what we have in the product is advanced session assurance, where any difference in the fingerprint can log you out and invalidates the session. That's the default behavior right now. But what is continuous authentication and authorization is basically about adding a second factor authentication or creating a different action based on any change in the fingerprint. So that adds a step to prompt the user for a second factor authentication. So at this point, again, like I said about the intercept case, this feature as well is not right now there in the product, but we have completed the POC and analysis of this. And this will be definitely in the product, and which is targeted for Q4 of 2024. Right. So I think that's pretty much from the presentation side. Let's move on to see whether there are.
Yeah. Did you by chance give a fiscal quarter instead of a calendar? So I think the continuous is going to be the first half of 2024. Is that right?
No, it's going to be second calendar half
Okay.
of 2024. Yeah.
Okay, for continuous and for intercept. And when we use the phrase intercept, that's a brand for the user behavior analytics. When is that going to be available for general availability?
Yeah, that's we are targeting for the mid of 2024. So it's more about than operational procedure right now, because the system is all integrated and it's working. So there are certain aspects to be cleared, and we should be able to deliver that sooner.